Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, a member of the Direction Point Podcast Network. My name is Jason, and I'm coming to you live from St. James Park in London with my very special guest for the next few minutes.
Denise.
Denise, a pleasure to meet you in person after all these years of recording virtually.
Yes, absolutely. It's quite a coincidence that we're both in the UK at the same time.
We are normally 6 hours apart, me in Brooklyn and you in Norway, and we're recording on our respective video screens. And I usually have a cat on my computer staring down at you.
Yes, and today we are in St. James's Park in central London, and we are being honked at by some geese.
Some very unhappy geese having quite a day. Smudge is not here. She did not make the trip overseas with me, but she certainly would have had a thing or two to say about those geese.
Yes, and I think my cats would not have been well impressed either.
So you and I have just spent a couple of hours underground at the Winston Churchill War Rooms.
We have indeed. The first time I've ever visited that, but it's always good to do a touristy thing.
This is my fourth time in London. That has long been on my list of things to do, but with Mrs. Doctor Who novels and Callie off at the Taylor Swift concert tonight, I finally had some time on my own and a companion willing to go to the museums.
Yes, it's not always as easy as you might think to find these things.
No, and of course in the Winston Churchill War Rooms, the cabinet rooms, we found one Doctor Who reference. What was that?
Well, we saw a picture of Ian McNeice playing the Doctor in Victory of the Daleks.
There was a display of all the actors who have played Churchill over the years, from Gary Oldman to John Lithgow to Christian Slater, rather randomly, to Ian McNeice.
Yes, I saw him at a convention about 5 years ago. He's quite an elderly chap, of course, but he seemed in fine fettle.
He was at the very first L.I. Who, Long Island Doctor Who, in 2013, which now, come to think of it, was over a decade ago.
Yes.
And I did take pictures of him during his panel, and he was very displeased because he likes to charge by the photograph. Almost indistinguishable from Winston Churchill, the way he presents himself at a convention panel. Very forceful personality.
They don't make them like that anymore.
No, they do not. So, this week's episode is going to be concerning the Massacre, the 1966 Season 3 Doctor Who serial concerning a major tragedy in the history of France, circa 1572. Our historical travels this afternoon have very little connection to the Massacre, but I will say that I was at the Who shop in Eastern London earlier today, and I bought some of the new novelizations and comics-related book, which I'll get into in greater detail in later episodes. What have you been doing during your trip to London?
Well, I went to the Chelsea Physic Garden yesterday, which, because I have a garden and I'm quite interested in medicinal plants and learning more about botany and things, and I come across this in a book. I'd never heard of it before. So I thought, great, I've got a Sunday afternoon free, I'm going to go up there. It was absolutely lovely and I learnt a great deal.
It is funny to me how many place names in Brooklyn are derived from place names in the UK. And, of course, in Manhattan you have Chelsea, which I can't think of the Chelsea in London without thinking of the Chelsea back home.
Well, I've been staying with some friends and they're big Chelsea Football Club supporters, so Chelsea only means one thing to them.
And I understand you're going to be meeting some of our fellow Trap 1 people later on during your trip.
That's right, yes, they are coming over to the little village where my aunt lives, and we're all going to a pub. So that's me, Conrad, Colin and Cy Hart. So that will be brilliant. The first time I'm meeting Cy in real life as well.
Conrad, of course, I met him when I was here last about 6 weeks ago, and he did a special intro for me, much the same way that you're doing a special intro now.
Yes, he's a lovely guy. He's brilliant.
Unfortunately, I was not able to connect up with Cy during either of my trips here this summer, so you'll have to say hi to him for me.
I will do, yes.
I will be off to Cardiff tomorrow and then Dublin later in the week, so this is my last full day in London.
And you're doing all of this with jet lag.
All of this with jet lag. I nearly fell asleep because the Churchill Museum is underground and it's a lot of walking and it's very warm and it's very quiet. So I almost nodded off standing there reading some of the displays. but I've managed to rally for my second win. You and I are now going to grab a meal, I believe.
Yes, we're going to find some food and have a good chat and see what else we can find to talk about over your exciting holiday.
I did record a dinner time episode with Mark when he was in Los Angeles. We did my Seeds of Death interview while having dinner at the Gallifrey One Hotel. But since I did not charge you with reading a book for this trip, I will spare you that privilege, some might say, ordeal, others might say.
Well, let's just have a cocktail and a chat and a nice bite to eat.
And that's coming up for me. Coming up next for you after the break, Ian Potter and I will discuss Doctor Who, The Massacre, 1966. Let's get to it.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
I want to welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, Ian Potter. Ian, welcome back. This is your second appearance on the show, and hopefully not your last.
Well, let's hope not. There was something we were talking about me doing, and I had a little look at it and thought, ooh, there's a lot in that I'd forgotten, but we'll come to that when we come to that.
I had you on previously to discuss the Mythmakers, because you were literally the author of the book on the Mythmakers. And I'm having you on now to discuss The Massacre, for which you are not the Black Archives writer. That's friend of the show, James Courray Smith. But you expressed interest in talking about this story. There are certainly a ton of things to discuss. And the next time I have you on after this is for a novelization of a non-televised story, which also has Hartnell-era implications. So you are becoming the king of the Hartnells on Doctor Who literature.
I think you just want me on things where I can say, oh, what was John Wiles thinking? Because that just seems to be what a lot of these things come to. Well, all three of these things will have. Oh, I've given it away, really, haven't I now? But that's what all three of them have in common. It's John Wiles, and we're not quite certain what the intention behind the story was or quite how it ended up the way it did.
It is very much the subtext of the Black Archives on The Massacre. It could have been subtitled, What Was John Wiles Thinking? So let's backtrack a little bit. There are two universal constants for any episode of Doctor Who literature. I always wave my copy of the novelization in front of my guest, which you are doing right now, and I always have Smudge either sitting on my lap so that her tail is waving in front of the camera, or she is standing on the keyboard looking directly into the camera hole, and you can see Smudge, but you can't see me. I'm a little bit hamstrung, though, because I am recording this from my hotel room in London shortly after saying farewell to Denise from Trap One, with whom I had dinner. And listeners of this episode have already just heard her voice on the intro. So what I'm waving at you now, instead of The Massacre, is the novelization of The Church on Ruby Road, which I purchased at the Who Shop earlier today, which is not a book that is going to land the same as John Lucarotti's novelization of The Massacre, because this is an author who knows how to write non-run-on sentences, so it's a much easier book to read. But we're not here to
I have a
throw
list
spears.
of some of my favorite sentences that maybe we can get into later, but let's have that joy. It is a real step down in the writing of the previous two books by Lucarotti, and I do think it's about the time I think Nigel Robinson quits at Target, and I think it may have just fallen in interim before there was a new permanent editor. There's just grammatical things that go wrong. There are sentences which feel like they've been cut apart to try and make them make sense, but they're broken. And then there are the epic sentences which last forever. And I was very tempted to see how Peter Purves dealt with them I don't generally buy the audio versions, but there must have been stuff where he must have been rasping and gasping, trying to get the sense through of these long, involved sentences, very much like this one I'm doing now, with lots of subclauses and then digressions.
I will tell you, you have not heard the audio essay yet, which comes at the end of this episode. But I recorded the audio episode in the States before I flew out to London Heathrow. I picked 2 sentences from the book, each of which is about 9 or 10 or 11 lines of text long. I was not able to get through in one sentence, and I am a filibusterer. I can talk for a very long time without notes. I was defeated by trying to deliver these John Lucarotti sentences out loud.
I'm going to take a guess. Number 1. On the other hand, Simon de Val was stunned with admiration by the Admiral's audacity to seek out, in disguise, Lorans and Mus, the right-hand men of the two most influential Huguenots in France, King Henri of Navarre and the Admiral de Coligny.
That is a short sentence fragment compared to the two that I read out loud later in this episode.
Okay, my second theory, I've written obscenely long sentence, page 101. But now... Oh, this looks like the fella. Intimidated by the abbot's fire and brimstone eloquence, and despite his curiosity about this satanic abode, as the abbot described it, which sat in the courtyard of the Bastille, the king gave his consent to burn it at the stake, although he insisted that he should be present when it was destroyed.
What is a shame about the prose is that although it's telling a different story than the TV story, there are some very good aspects to this book. I love the idea that when King Charles opens up the council meeting, he is immediately struck by a tubercular coughing fit and literally coughs up blood into his silk handkerchief. That is an incredible image, and perhaps a bit too comedic for what the Massacre is on television, but a man who can visualize that kind of scene should be capable of writing better prose than he did. And John Lucarotti had done 2 novelizations that are much more easy to read aloud than this one.
Yeah. But, again, we don't know how much might have been Nigel Robinson's Invisible Mending. I noticed as well, we get Stephen with a PH. We get Stevens instead of Stephen, like he's just come out of the Green Death.
Stevens, you are inefficient, but you are also a fool.
Yes. Alsatians is spelt 2 different ways, one of which is wrong. And then there are sentences which don't grammatically make sense, where you think they've cut a bit out. There's a bit where Stephen wonder something instead of wonders, and it's just like, and it just feels like there's been an attempt to tidy up prose in a rush. In a way, I guess it's the downside where you have the original authors, rather than Terence, is that Terence doesn't need as much cleaning up work by the crew at Target. And normally your plus would be, we get some idea of the original intent of the story, because that writer, even though 20 years later, is going back to their own words. In this case, he's gone back to Donald Tosh's words and gone, no, that isn't it. I'm going to create something which is true to what I wanted to do, but obviously it's a reconstruction and a reinvention. It's almost the first original Doctor Who novel, because he's taken the basic idea of his script Lost and Donald Tosh's script shunted around out of bits of his. You can tell, I think the opening tavern scene is so well reflected in the novel. You think, okay, that must be Lucarotti's, or he was 30 pages in and went, none of this is mine. I give up here and start reinventing. It's one of those two. But there are just little glimpses of stuff that tallies across the two that makes you think that was Lucarotti's original purpose. But he talks very openly about having done lots of additional research and invented this new plot using the tunnels of Paris out of, he didn't know about it in the 60s. So that's all 80s invention. And it's why, to be honest, I didn't buy this book until years later. A friend, Candy Gent, was selling off some of her Target books, and I'd stopped because I'd got interested in beer and university at this point, and I'd read a review of this saying John Lucarotti doesn't novelize the episode. He novelizes the idea of how it should have gone, and I sort of, woof, not for me. I'm a purist. I don't want that. I was a fool, because what Lucarotti does is really interesting, but as we've both agreed, that the prose is a bit of a pig.
James Courret Smith in the Black Archive, and this is about 8 years old now, but I'm reading it for the first time this week. Purchased it a long time ago. Finally got a chance to read it in connection with this episode. he does a very good forensic job of trying to track down, because we don't have access to John Lucarati's original 1965 scripts. We know that he was given the Donald Tosh scripts. We know that Donald Tosh is a bit of a fabulous when it comes to upselling his contributions to the show, and the criticisms that he made of the original scripts probably were fictitious. But we also know that Lucarati did his own research, so we don't know how much of this novelization is a reconstruction of his original submission versus taking the bare bones of the Donald Tosh script and building something new on top of it. So as I'll get into in the audio essay, this is not a story that is trying to get William Hartnell fired from his own show. No. It's a story that gives William Hartnell two actual roles and two distinct characters, where instead he's only the abbot for 2.5 scenes, and he's the doctor for even less than that. So this is much more of a Doctor Who story. But the Massacre by itself is a curiosity because it's a story where Stephen is the lead. It's a story where Stephen is a totally inept failure as a lead. And I was gratified to see James Courray-Smith point this out so carefully for the Black Archive. And it's a story where the Doctor has no part to play and no heroism at all. It's a very pre-Doctor Who conception of who the Doctor is. And it's the conception of the character that no longer exists by the time Keys of Marinus comes around. So it's a very extreme throwback. So let's talk about the story itself, and I'll start you off with the 3 Darren Mooney questions. Number 1, does the Massacre belong on a list of the 60 greatest Doctor Who stories ever made in the first 60 years of the program?
No, I think ultimately it is a wrong turn for the series. In that it really just kiboshes the whole. Well, it gets into the whole thing of non-intervention, and then fudges it dreadfully. It has the worst introduction of a new companion ever. The Doctor, there is a ghost of him being central to the storyline. Otherwise the abbot is not his exact double, but there's no attempt to address that. And it's one saving grace, I would say, is the supporting actors sound terrific. And I think Peter Purves himself was very confused about the direction and whether he was going to be sacked like everyone else. He felt very vulnerable and insecure. And I think that probably really helped him playing A, the lead, which he'd been doing magnificently a great deal in Doctor Who already, but B, a man who hasn't got a clue what's coming next, because there are factions at work on either side behind the scenes who are quietly at war. So I think the nature of the production benefits perhaps Peter Purves' performance there. But I think the Massacre, we're always told that William Hartnell said too much evil was creeping into Doctor Who. I think it is a story which is, it's almost Saywood era kind of bleak, and I don't know if it's right for that era. I think there are legitimately good things in there, but I'd say it's destroyed. And I would suspect if you look at those camera scripts, the scene numbering is really interesting because it vanishes a great deal of the time. Sometimes we go from scene 5 to scene 10, and there's only 4 scenes in between. If you look at the scenes which get cut most severely, there's a whole page goes from the opening tavern scene just before Hartnell leaves. Scene 3, there are 2 scenes that are heavily look like they've been heavily cut because they're now new scenes with no numbers. There are 3 scenes in a row. The fifth scene and the 7th scene are both Abbott scenes. There's a big cut in episode 2, which I would say is almost certainly an Abbott scene. And I think what's happened is they've gone, we can't rely on Hartnell. He didn't even turn up for episode 11 of Dalek Master Plan, apart from doing his little cameo at the end. We're having to rewrite at short notice. Let's reduce his role as much as possible. And then that destroys the possibility, which is the main thing the story is about, is he the abbot? Is he not the abbot? Is he the abbot? Is he not the abbot? Because he's not there, we don't get a proper explanation. Hartnell's great scene in it, in episode 4, they've specifically had a recording break just before that, because he's got his big speech. And if he'd messed that up, they would have just had to go back to that bit and do it 2 or 3 times till it was right. That they didn't trust their leading man. And I'm fairly confident he didn't trust them either. But what they did was they destroyed the narrative they had. And I like Lucarotti's attempt to make sense of it and to do the thing you have in the double scene is which one is which. Oh, they confront. But for being too complicated or Hartnell being too untrustworthy in the production team's eyes, they've taken away the point of the series, and it's the serial. And there's no surprise that Lucarotti would be cross, because they've really made it gibberish, and there's no explanation where the Doctor's been for 3 episodes. He's just, oh, never mind. So it's the remains of a much more interesting story, I suspect. And it's interesting to us because we're forensic archaeologists rather than people who actually sit down and enjoy a program. I mean, it helps it's not there. But yeah, it's a shame. And I was thinking, well, how could you fix the massacre? And I had the weirdest idea, and it would work for this one story, but then it would destroy the rest of Doctor Who. And it would be that the Abbot is the Doctor, but he's the Doctor from the future trying to put right what he did by intervening in the first place, because maybe Stephen dies, and so the Abbot is preventing the Doctor changing history, but at the cost of of that possible future Doctor's future life. Now, it would be chaotic because the whole thing plays on whether you intervene or not, and then doesn't give you an answer. And I just thought, what if we dramatise the Doctor intervening and then having to intervene to put it right? So yeah, that's just crazy fan talk. But it feels like once upon a time there was something more interesting in the Massacre, which John Lucarotti is reaching for in this book. But I think if his original scripts had survived, he could have spent more time on his prose, linking up the speeches he already had.
So James Courret Smith touches upon a lot of this in the Black Archive, and those of you who do not have his Black Archive yet, it's one of the very first ones.
Yeah.
I urge you to go out and purchase if a hard copy still exists. Otherwise, the digital download, which I have on my Kindle and which came with me, while my copy of The Massacre, the paperback, stayed in New York, the Kindle is with me here in London, and I have that loaded onto my Kindle. But I'll just say this. He also acknowledges the fabulous casting in the story because the director, Patty Russell, one of the first 2 female directors the BBC ever had, and because of her work as a PA earlier on, she had access to an amazing Rolodex of talent. So you get Eric Thompson, you get Andre Morell, you get David Weston, you get Barry Justice, you get a phenomenal cast of characters, many of whom never meet the Doctor, leading to this unique story structure where the main villains of the piece, the Marshal Tavan and Catherine de Medici, are tertiary characters that only appear fleetingly and whom the Doctor and Stephen never meet. And they are some of the most evil creatures we've ever gotten on the show. So that's a point from James Courret Smith. The ineptness of John Wiles and the disaster that John Wiles made of the production office, he gets quotes from Peter Purves, where Peter Purves is burning bridges and is just laying every fault that John Wiles brought to the table. And the next point James Courret Smith makes, Wiles and Tosh joined this show with the belief that William Hartnell is the wrong actor to play the Doctor, and he's a terrible person, nasty to puppies and kittens, hated by children. This show cannot work with William Hartnell in it. James Courret Smith goes to the ratings and points out that in terms of raw popularity, no Doctor has ever been as popular as William Hartnell. And after they got him off the show, no Doctor has ever again reached his heights in terms of raw viewers and in terms of top 10 rankings. So maybe getting rid of Hartnell was not such a good idea. And maybe the stories about him being sick weren't true. And obviously he had a very shortened lifespan after this, but they intentionally sabotaged the show, and they accidentally made some great drama in the interim between Dalek's master plan, which John Wiles disowned, and this story. But this is a story where the production team is, to coin a phrase, massacring somebody else's script. For me, this is in my top 60. And in fact, I have it ranked at number 41, but I'll explain why on my next question. Would this be on your personal list of your 60 favorite Doctor Who's?
I must be a bad Doctor Who fan because I don't make enough lists. It's probably the wrong. It's certainly nowhere. It's nowhere in my bottom half of Doctor Who, but it's difficult because it's one of those ones where I think if it came back, apart from we would see the performances, and that would give it a little boost. It feels so verbal that I don't know that we're missing a great deal from it. Yes, I'd quite like to see exactly what's going on with the TARDIS doors in episode 4. People are quite excited about the terrible side of the TARDIS on location, which is a badly painted flat, and B, the possibility that the internal doors were visible. The external doors, the back of them was visible through the opening hexagonal doors. So, but it feels to me like it's good enough as an audio, and I quite like elements of it, but my frustrations with it mean that it's never in the upper echelons for me. So I have a lot of respect for it, but it's grudging respect for bits of it. Paddy Russell is clearly, you're absolutely right, is a towering force. She'd worked with Rudolph Cartier, who's the big name really in early BBC TV drama, and that's exactly as you say where the great casts come from. Is she has learnt from the master, and she has made the connections.
There are 3 Patty Russells in my top 60 because she also gives you Pyramids of Mars. Speaking of stories that are expertly cast, in fact, Michael Bilton is the link between the Massacre and Pyramids of Mars because he plays Teligny in this story, and then he has a very small part as one of the early kills in Pyramids of Mars. He is adorably befuddled in both stories, and I think he's terrific for the show, and she's the only person who can get him over the lintel. And of course, she also does Horror of Fang Rock, which is probably just as high up. In fact, let me go to my list. I have the Massacre at number 41. I have Pyramids of Mars at number 7, and I have Horror of Fang Rock at number 16. Although for me, Pyramids of Mars is somewhat retroactively diminished by Empire of Death, so maybe Horror of Fang Rock would now be a tick higher. I don't know. But that's 3 Patty Russells in my top 41. And even though I love Invasion of the Dinosaurs as my birthday story, Invasion of the Dinosaurs is not on this list through no fault of Patty Russell's own.
No. The one thing I would say, because there's Empire of Death did not satisfy me. The Sutek finale did not satisfy me. It was the weakest point really of the new series for me. But the one thing in its credit is I was watching Pyramids of Mars again a couple of years ago and thought, why does Sutek have different faces throughout it? And then I realized, what if when there's the time distortion at the start and Sutek's face comes on the TARDIS wall, that's actually him going backwards in time through the time tunnel, and that's his face rotting as he ages. And I think that Russell must have had something like that at the back of his head for, Sutek was stuck to the TARDIS before he even met the Doctor. As a marvelous idea. And then somehow that evaporated somewhat into something that wasn't very satisfying at all for me, and I think for a lot of fans of our age who grew up adoring Pyramids.
And that is the sad part of what Empire of Death tells us, that every Doctor Who story that takes place after Pyramids of Mars is a sequel to Pyramids of Mars, because in the Armageddon factor, Sutek is clinging to the outside of the TARDIS. In Florida Doomsday, Sutekh spends 4 days
I think that's
wandering
why
around.
the light bulb went blue at the top, actually, because of Sutekh over the big blue light. It's probably why that later Graham Williams TARDIS got a bit shrunken, just Sutekh leaning on the top of it. But
Right. But in Florida Doomsday, Sutekh is able to hop off and spend 4 days wandering around Monarch's ship. Terror of the Vervoids, which is the next story that I'm coming to on the show. Because we are in 1987, dealing
Sutekh
with
is
all the
making
old
sure
books.
that cricket balls go in the right direction in Florida
That's right.
Doomsday. That's why it all works.
But my point is that because 1987 is the retro year with all Hartnell and Troughton stories, I have not done a novelization since Empire of Death aired that has been a sequel to Pyramids of Mars. So Terror of the Vervoids in 2 weeks will be the first story since Empire of Death aired that is actually a sequel to Pyramids that will be covered on Doctor Who literature. So we can now imagine in Terror of the Vervoids that it is Sutekh drawing the TARDIS into the black hole of Tartarus. So
Yeah.
you raise another point that I want to come back to, and this is something else that James Couray Smith points out as proof of John Wiles' ineptitude. John Wiles, as a line producer, had no organizational skills, and he stupidly schedules the telecine recordings for the Massacre on the exact same day that is the studio recording for episode 11 of the Daleks Master Plan, the Abandoned Planet. So the TARDIS is needed in Lime Grove D for Stephen and Sarah to emerge from, but it is also needed at Ealing to represent 16th century Paris. So as you say, this inept, bizarre-looking flat is assembled to play the role of the TARDIS door in episode 4 for the one scene because the TARDIS prop could not be in two places at the same time.
That's really interesting, because that does make me wonder if that's why Hartnell's role is so reduced on episode 11 of Dalek's Master Plan, is that he's required to be seen in a carriage briefly for the telecine stuff for episode 2. I don't know. I know it must be a different telecine session, mustn't it? It must be the telecine session for episode 4 for the Wimbledon Common stuff. Ignore me on that front.
I'm going to pull up, because James Couray Smith does a production diary of the Massacre in the Black Archive, so let me call it up right now. Nothing is more exciting than listening to me fumble my way through my Kindle, so we are quickly going to go to the fact machine. And I want to point out to you, Ian, that even though I left Smudge in the States, and even though I left my copy of the Massacre in the States, I brought the fact machine with me. So the fact machine is actually sitting right here in my hotel room. And it tells us that the filming of William Hartnell in his 18-second telecine insert as the Abbot on episode 2 was filmed at Ealing on Thursday, January 6th. And it was the Wimbledon Common filming on Friday, January 7th, 1966, that took place at the same day as the Abandoned Planet. So it is the TARDIS prop on location in Wimbledon that Jackie Lane runs into that is not the real TARDIS.
Yeah.
So thank you, fact machine. I'm going to pack that back up to go back to New York with me.
Hand luggage only. You don't want to get that thing lost somewhere in transit.
I have put a fragile label and I've put my home address on the fact machine. But you were saying?
I was saying something. I doubt I know what it was anymore. It's good to know. I mean, I wonder. So Hartnell would have done his Ealing filming the day before, and it's a tiny amount. And then they cut the Abbot right down in it. There's something going on with their lack of trust of Hartnell at that point. And I wonder if episode 11 of Dalek Master Plan, the fact that he's not in so much of it and they rewrite round it and then he makes the tiny appearance at the end, it does almost feel like he could have been trying it on and pulling his weight and going, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, and trying to put them in a difficult situation. Or it could just have been that they really, really took against him and wanted as little of him in that episode as possible, so that he would be able to do his episode 12 stuff. I really don't know what they were thinking at any point.
These are the same people that decided to make Katerina a companion and then realized about 10 minutes into the writing of the arc that this wouldn't work. Then they do the exact same thing, and after firing poor Adrian Hill, they decide to cast Anne Chaplay as a companion. And again, it's the same problem. She's a teenager from the 16th century, which leads to the problem in The Celestial Toymaker of Anne as a companion being very naive and constantly giving the game away to her adversaries. And when they decide to replace her with Dodo, they picked the name Dodo because it had to fit the same four-letter space in the script as Anne, and they typed over drafts of Toymaker. And that is why Dodo appears to be so stupid in Celestial Toymaker, because it wasn't Dodo, it was Anne, and the production team once again cast a companion they didn't know what to do with.
I'm so cynical about the decisions they had to make to fit in with stuff they already had that I think that Dodo has a great aunt she lives with entirely because there was an aunt that Anne lived with, and they could avoid having to type out an entirely new line, and they could just turn great aunt into aunt or aunt into great aunt. It's just, I think it really is sometimes that basic. It's like, that's a lot of retyping. Oh, we can give her some form of aunt as well.
And I want to point out that you have now used Dodo's original accent for more time in this podcast than Jackie Lane was allowed to use it on screen. Before I said, no, RP only.
I think you'll find that Jackie Lane's Dodo must come from same kind of family as Daphne Moon in Frasier, in that all the members of her family have entirely different accents from different parts of the UK. So, and some of them not from the UK at all. But I mean, it's one of those bizarre things is that she was Mancunian. She was from Manchester, and Wiles had met her in Manchester playing a Cockney schoolgirl in a play that he'd written, which is why people for years say, oh, she played Cockney schoolgirl Dodo. It's just a misremembering, mangled up version of that story before anyone could hear the order of the Massacre and realise what she was doing. Well, not just what she was doing, also what she's doing. An echo of something from earlier on. An echo. It's so hard to listen to that final scene, and there's so much lovely stuff in it. But these little ghosts of print through or from other layers of the tape. But it's really, again, you think it may speak to a culture at the BBC that were just trying to stop John Wiles doing anything he wanted, because there's a note from Gerald Savory that goes, Stephen is speaking too much about science fiction stuff about the future. We have to remember he's a contemporary character, and he clearly, and obviously someone decided that Dodo had to be RP, and so it feels like there were edicts coming down that scuppered every decision. You just wonder if they were nudging until he just threw his hands up in despair, which from Peter Purvis's accounts, he threw his hands up in despair quite regularly. But it's a mess of a period, and it's in a way it's a shame that we can't see it more fully, because I think it might be a bit like those episodes of Dark Shadows where they're clearly just desperately trying to keep it together, and Carolyn's face changes for one episode into someone scary and then goes back again. That kind of treading water period, and we can tell that they're treading water, but we don't have all the evidence on screen, sadly.
And not only that, the actress who played Carolyn Stoddard for one episode of Dark Shadows has a 6-inch height differential from Nancy Barrett. So all of a sudden, the height of Carolyn goes from here to here to here in a 3-episode span. And then you also have the problem. You have Alexandra Moltke, who is the series lead, who is being diminished because there are other characters on the show that Dan Curtis has fallen in love with more. This show has gone from Jane Eyre to Dracula to Frankenstein to something out of Dennis Wheatley, because you literally have Satan on the show for a couple of episodes. Alexandra Moltke then gets pregnant. Alexandra Moltke then gets pregnant, as some people say. Just like to pronounce it incorrectly. And she has to leave the show on very short notice. So they bring in 2 other actors to play Victoria Winters, but one of them lasts for 6 episodes and the other lasts for 2. and then Victoria Winters is off the show forever, and she's never to be mentioned again. But Dan Curtis was one single producer doing a daily show for 5 years. John Wiles was on Doctor Who for 6 months. And I have to say that for a daily soap with a budget the size of a can of Pringles, Dan Curtis and his team did a lot better work with Dark Shadows. And yet, at the same time, I think some of the stories that came out under John Wiles are phenomenal, and he has an outsized presence in my top 60. So we've already done the first 2 Darren Mooney questions. Let's do the third. And I have to amend this question somewhat, because the actual question that Darren Mooney asks on every episode of the 250 is, if a listener has not seen this movie, do you recommend they pause the podcast, stream the movie to a local device, and then resume listening to the episode? We can't really stream the Massacre to a local device. So let me ask you instead of recommending, which version of the story would you recommend? And I'll preface that by saying that I had immense trouble understanding the story because I had, courtesy of Napster 25 years ago, an unlawful recording minus the Peter Purvis linking narration.
Yeah.
I had the online transcripts on an old defunct website called Behind the Sofa, not the same as Chrissy's transcripts that I use for the episodes now. You have the loose cannon recon. Because there were no telesnaps, because John Wiles, among many other questionable decisions, didn't want to give John Cura any work, they had to do photo composites. Now, I had been under the impression, and I mentioned this impression on last week's show, I was under the impression that Ian Levine was hiring his outfit to do AI reconstructions of the camera scripts, and that's what he was showing. But a friend of mine did show me the first 5 minutes of The Massacre Part 1 on his cell phone. He wasn't going to show me the whole thing because I'm not a subscriber. But as far as I can tell, that's just all he did was have his AI team animate the loose cannon recon. So it's the same photo composites. You have the head of Eric Thompson with a Photoshop goatee over the body of someone else wearing a Frenchman's 16th century noble outfit that Eric Thompson might not have worn in the actual episode itself. Yeah. And this is what Ian Levine's team has narrated for him. So I don't know if I, in good conscience, could recommend.
It's very difficult when his stated ambition is to be more true to the original TV shows than the reinventions for animation. That he then is taking a best representation from existing publicity stills that doesn't really reflect the camera shots and trying to exude photorealism out of that, because it isn't going to happen and it isn't going to reflect the original program any more than a celestial toy maker that you can watch without becoming quite bored does in animated form. So it's I think possibly he doesn't feel that cartoons are for him. Any form of animation isn't realistic because he's like a lot of Doctor Who fans. He's invested in it being taken seriously and invested in it being drama, but he's chasing after a level of photorealism and with claims of accuracy which can't be backed up, with technology that isn't ready, and spending, as far as I can ascertain, vast sums of money on something that doesn't really work. And I would wish him well if I didn't think he was wasting his time and putting himself in a position where a lot of people are going to mock his efforts because what he's desiring isn't really achievable. And so you're always going to get something which feels very uncanny valley because real human voices, slightly muffled, with kind of strangely morphing kind of plasticinized photorealism, but with bits gummed on. It is not nice to look at. So it's a shame, but I guess it's his decision. And because it is a personal and private project, I don't have to look at it. But I would far rather see Ian Levine wrote diaries where he recounted his recollections of Doctor Who stories between I think between a week and 6 months after they were on air. I think it slipped as you went on. But I would love to see what young Ian had written down in his log of what was in the massacre, because I think even those are going to be memories which are transmuted in the recollection. They're going to be much closer to what happened in the 1960s than anything we can with good conscience attempt to recreate now.
That was the very first question that I asked John Peel, who's a friend of this show, when I met John Peel for the very first time at Elihu in 2013. Because John is like me, a fellow New Yorker. We live at opposite ends of the same island. I see him at every Elihu, which sadly I am missing because Elihu is this weekend. As you and I are talking, Elihu hasn't happened yet. But as this episode is being streamed by the DWLit Nation on Sunday morning, Elihu is actually in progress, and John Peel is there, and I'm missing it for the first time in many years.
Yeah.
But when I met John Peel at the first Elihu in 2013, I asked him, before you became a New Yorker, you lived in the UK, and you were watching Doctor Who live as it went out in 1963 as a very young man. We can't see Marco Polo anymore, but we know that Waris Hussein was an incredible director because of the surviving work that we get from Unearthly Child. Do you recall what directorial tricks Waris Hussein might have given us on Marco Polo? And he thought it was a great question, but of course at that point, at that age, he wasn't looking to see what the director was doing. He was following the dialogue and the on-screen actor, so he didn't have an answer to the question. But we know that Patty Russell would have given us a very lively in-studio production. Yeah. But Loose Cannon wasn't following that because they have some impossible camera angles.
Yeah.
You assume that there are 4 cameras in studio that day for War of God. 2 of them are going to be on the small set where the Doctor and Ian are talking. But according to Loose Cannon, those cameras were right next to each other because you have an angle of William Hartnell head on and then a 90-degree angle to his face. And that's not the camera angle we would have seen. And that's what Ian Levine gives us in the animation that I saw, because all he is doing is giving rudimentary animation to the Loose Cannon telesnaps. So back to my question, which I started 7 minutes ago. Which version of the Massacre would you recommend that somebody watch for the first time if they have never seen the Massacre before, be it the book, the audio, the recon, the Ian Levine animation, or what have you?
I say if you want to understand the Massacre, the best way to consume it is to get the camera script PDFs that come with the reissue of the Missing Audios box set, because you see who's getting their lines right, who's having their lines cut, who's paraphrasing their lines loosely. You get to see also bits where Tosh goes, "Oh, and this is what the king's like, and this is what his relationship is like with the Queen Mother," in stage directions, which you hope would come across on screen, but it's not really necessary. It's a note for the actor rather than for anyone else involved. And I think that's the way to go at it first, because as raw audio, I don't think descriptions are always helpful in giving you a sense of place and time and who's in the room. And the only things you really miss, I would say, in the camera scripts is when Anne runs away and it's all on film. It's, as quite often happened with film sequences, it's just summarized. So Dodo running towards the TARDIS as well on film, very, very quickly summarized. So you lose little tiny moments, but it gives you the sense of it. And you realize that Anne Chaplet is delivering her lines much more loosely than Hartnell is. In that she's basically decided to play her younger and more conversational than I think she's scripted, and I think it's because they made the decision to go for a regional English accent to denote that she's a peasant from the sticks, and so she tweaks, I would say, about 3/4 of her lines just in small areas, and you forget that none of this is Shakespeare, and people are working with the text, but obviously. That means you have to go to the audio after. But I would say start with the camera script and you'll know what's going on. Then the audio will help you. Then if you'd like to, look at the 7 or 8 pictures of people in their costumes, and definitely look at the woodcuts, which must have been a really horrible way to end a serial. And clearly audiences at the time thought, this is too strong for Doctor Who, this is nasty. But, you know, whilst in most of the things he wrote, there was a lot he did about suffering and the innocent suffering, and it seems to be one of the things he felt made for good punchy drama is to have young people tragically die at the end for no very clear purpose. Again, proto-Eric Saywood. So I would say you go script, you go audio, you look at the photographic stuff. If you want to go to some form of recon after that, then do it. But you just have to remember that none of the rules of visual grammar, which you know Paddy Russell was so good at, are going to be obeyed, because we don't have enough photos of these people's faces, and so we're fudging constantly. And actually, I think there's a point where you just go, I'll just have a vague idea of who the actors are and imagine it in my own head. If you have that kind of ability, just go that way every time.
And just as a matter of visuals, something else we get from the production diary that James Courray Smith assembles for the Black Archive, Paddy Russell actually did telecine inserts of 3 dead faces, victims of the massacre. So you're going to see in rapid succession on TV in 1966, 3 corpses on screen, cut,
Yeah.
which on top of the woodcuts used to demonstrate the massacre. And this is about a 60-second sequence. Must have been some of the most shocking television in the raw that Doctor Who's ever done. Which leads me to my next question. I'm going to play you an audio clip from episode 4 of the massacre, but not the clip you're expecting. I'm going to ask you, what the heck is going on in this scene?
Who are you?
Where's the telephone?
What did you say?
The telephone. I've got to ring up.
Oh, pull yourself together, child. I think you've made a mistake.
Who are you? Are you the police?
Oh, good gracious, of course not.
Well, this is a police box. It says so outside.
Yes, I know, but it isn't if you know what I mean. Now run along and find another police box. In any case, child, what do you want to do with the police?
There's been an accident. A little boy's been hurt, and I've got to phone the police.
Oh, well, I'm afraid I can't help you. No, you must run along and phone the police somewhere else. At the same time, phone for an ambulance.
Wait a minute. If this isn't a police box, what is it? And who are you?
Well, my dear, I'm a doctor of science, and this machine is for traveling through time and relative dimensions in space. Now, you...
Come again.
Oh, never mind, my dear. Never mind. Run along.
There's something odd going on.
Oh, please, child.
Quick! You've got to take off.
Oh, so you come back, my boy.
Yes, I've come back. We can't go into that now. There are 2 policemen coming over the common towards the TARDIS.
Coming here? Good gracious, they'll want to use the telephone. Exactly, thank you.
Oh, that was close.
What just happened? The implication is that Stephen has accidentally hurt a young boy or killed a young boy, and that's why he's following Dodo into the TARDIS, saying, "You've got to leave right now." What did Stephen do in those 45 seconds that he was on the ship?
I think, and again, I think it's because it's not because we don't have the telecine insert described in the script. I think what's happened is Dodo has witnessed a car accident in which a small boy is hurt, and then Stephen is running panicked from the police who are approaching, thinking they're going to get implicated in it. But it is so slapdash and quick, and it's not clear exactly what's going on. B, I have a suspicion that the Doctor will have changed the nature of time by letting that little boy bleed to death somewhere on the sidewalk. And C, that this is an attempt to do the entirety of an unearthly child in 3.5 minutes, that the Doctor is scared about people on Earth interfering, and what you have to do is run away very quickly as soon as there's any chance of that happening. And we've rebooted the series. We've reintroduced the series concept on a postcard at the end of this this story.
Following the bizarre exchange where the doctor says, "Doesn't she look just like my granddaughter?" and Stephen goes, "I have no idea who that is."
Yes, it's funny, that little continuity thing. That's, oh yes, I can remember the names of my old companions, and I'll say them in a row, and I'll do that joke you remember from the first year. And it's like a fan advisor broke in and made them do references to the start of the series. Yeah, it's an odd little sequence, but it has to be said that, clearly they did have the recording break there because they knew they were giving Hartnell a meaty bit, having given him essentially 3 lines in the rest of the episode.
Yes.
But he delivers it really well, and he delivers it pretty much word perfect. As I say, most people are paraphrasing to some degree in this thing. It's nothing like the end of Galaxy 4, where he's clearly so exhausted that he's just busking his way through something that only slightly approximates the original ending. It's a very odd decision, but it's an odd decision that grew out of their own bizarre decision to get rid of Maureen O'Brien, and that just sends a cascade of chaos through the rest of the season. And it could have so easily been avoided if they'd just gone, okay, we've had a difference of opinion, how can we work together as adults, rather than, no, you are my enemy and you must be destroyed.
And what's amazing about the Blu-rays or the Celestial Toymaker that we're getting now, you are getting interviews with Carol Ann Ford, and you're getting interviews with Maureen O'Brien filmed cutting edge 2023, 2024. They are still bitter about how they were both cut off from the show. They're still angry about it almost 60 years later. And I love that. I love that they are still angry about these things that happened back in the distant past.
Well, if you look at the paper trail with Carol Ann, she was wanting to go from quite early on, and I think she's probably actually more cross that actually, having decided she wanted to go, I think by Marco Polo she decided she wanted out, but actually then the series becomes huge, and then it overshadows a great deal of the rest of her career. And it's the cruel thing as well that as an actress gets older, there was a whole period in British television, she's working well into the 1970s, things like The Likely Lads and stuff she does good work in, but television never gives her anything as good as Susan again. And even though Susan wasn't what she was originally sold, she wasn't quite the out of this world space kid, it was probably the biggest role she ever got, and she's still playing it today, and she's playing it marvelously, actually.
Yeah, her point is that they cast her specifically to do all these exciting things like horseback riding, and then they wouldn't let her do any of it.
I think just Sidney Newman wrote nuts next to every time. The nuts. That's a very well-known Canadian accent I just did there. I don't think so.
Sidney and I probably have some common DNA. I don't know if any of his ancestors or any of his descendants are on 23andMe. I could double check, but his accent probably sounded much like my grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
So, coming across towards the end of our recording, we've talked about the novelization and some of the epic run-on sentences. We have talked about the various versions of the Massacre that exist. We've talked about efforts to reconstruct the story. We've talked about the utter hash that John Wiles made of the show. I think the Massacre works in spite of that, and that's why I have it at number 41. Bearing in mind that my top 60 list, and I know I've said this before, repeat listeners can fast forward 30 seconds. This is a representational list. Some stories are standing in for others. I could not have all 8 Roger Delgado stories on the list, even though they could have been. I could easily have had every historical in the top 60, but obviously I can't fit them. Some stories have to stand in for others, and that is why the Aztecs is not on this list. As great as it is, there are historicals that are better. The Massacre is in there because it's the kind of story that Doctor Who can tell only once. It's the story where the Doctor loses. The Doctor doesn't think to know where they are when they exit the TARDIS. He goes off on a side quest. He comes back. The second he comes back, he learns the date. He says, we have to leave right now. And he can't even save Anne Shaplay's life properly. He is so scared that he runs away. Now, this should break the format of the show, but Donald Tosh leaves. And immediately the Doctor has a new companion thrown at him, and the next episode is the Ark, where he literally saves all of mankind in a 5-minute lab montage. This episode could have broken the show. You can tell this story where the Doctor fails once or twice a decade. This is the first time the Doctor has been defeated on camera. And I think because of the quality of the production and the actors that Patty Russell casts and the speeches they give, once you figure out who's who, and once you figure out which ones are the Catholics and which are the Protestants, I think this is a very powerful story. And I'm glad that not every historical is like it, and I'm glad they never tried it again. But you have these dark, tragic historicals throughout season 3 between the Mythmakers, which has a horrific ending. Horrific as in very depressing, not as in badly made. The Gunfighters Part 4 has an incredibly dark ending. This story has an incredibly dark ending. This is great drama, and that's why this and the Gunfighters are both in my top 60. I acknowledge the story has faults. I think the story that John Luca Wrighty tells in the novelization is better Doctor Who than The Massacre, but it's so ineptly written as a piece of prose that the novelization is not high atop my list.
Yeah,
what else can you say about The Massacre? What else might you have in your notes?
I suppose the other thing really, which I think is interesting about it, is that it slightly fudges, I think, and conflates the idea of the state or the royal family having a grudge against some of the Huguenots, because this Calvinist idea that the kings owe their presence to the people rather than to Rome and to God, and there's that tension there. And I think both versions of it are a little bit kind of, and then there's the mob's revolt against the Huguenots because they think they've killed the abbot. And that there's something going on in the way that we've had these cynical people in powerful positions prodding the mob into violent action across the world quite recently. But I don't think they ever quite square that there was some court politicking, but there was also a mass of ordinary Parisians who were poor, were troubled by this royal wedding, and thought that the Huguenots were replacing them or some other such nonsense. And it just feels like the link isn't quite fully there as to the causes behind the massacre. We have the court intrigue and we have the nudge the mob, but I almost feel like the ordinary people and how they felt is something that goes underexplored. And I think that the two versions of the story, it's slightly different as to whether it's Catherine de Medici or the king really who's the prime motivator. It's slightly different degrees, which I think is John Luca Rossi going and doing further research and finding a different view of it to Donald Tosh. What else can I really say about it? That I love Eric Thompson's voice, and that in the UK he voiced the Magic Roundabout, which was a very popular series for years. He had this marvelous kind of laconic tone, which you hear little glimpses of it in The Massacre, and a British man of a certain age just smiles fond memories of childhood. The only other thing I can say is that I loathe and detest the section where the TARDIS gets burned. It just feels nonsense. It doesn't feel properly religiously researched, and it doesn't feel like it's got proper jeopardy. So it kind of feels to me it falls between both stools. It's not good Doctor Who, because we're at a point when we read the novel that we know the TARDIS isn't going to be burnt alive. If only Sutek had been on it at that point. And it doesn't feel historically right. So it just feels like a bit of a terrible fudge, but it does build up 20 or 30 pages. So there you go.
Interesting points there, especially about Eric Thompson's voice. There's a high percentage of people in the story who come back and work on Doctor Who again, although Andre Morell graduates to the big leagues, and in 9 more years he is cast by Stanley Kubrick and has a very strong but small part in the second half of Barry Lyndon, which is one of my parents' favorite movies. So I saw a lot of Barry Lyndon growing up, and Andre Morell from Doctor Who's The Massacre is in it. And yes, I'll give a final word to James Courret Smith, who goes deep into the history of this. He rebuts the idea that the massacre is an obscure historical event that viewers in 1966 would not have heard of. Quite the opposite. And he also goes into the fact that when John Lucarotti wrote the novelization, the historical belief was that Catherine de' Medici was responsible, but later on, what he describes as magisterial research comes out after that, and we now know that she was not responsible at all. So even though Donald Tosh claims to have rewritten the TV scripts for accuracy, we know that Donald Tosh was a fabulist. James Courret Smith gives us many other reasons why Donald Tosh might have had to rewrite the scripts, nothing to do with John Lucarotti's first drafts being subpar. But Donald Tosh actually got it right. Catherine de' Medici was not responsible for the assassination of the admiral. So that's one part where the TV story, by accident, winds up being more historically accurate, maybe, than anything else.
Yeah. There is one other thing, actually, and it's such a small issue, but which incarnation of the Doctor do you think is in the opening and closing sequences? Because it's written with just insufficient description that you can cast most of the male Doctors afterwards in that role if you squint. I mean, I think John Lucarotti is thinking Hartnell because he only really thinks Hartnell. I listened to his original version of Doctor Who and the Ark for early Tom Baker, and really and what the later Tom Baker does with it, he recognises it's not really like his Doctor and does bizarres of his own creation on top of it. But it feels like you could plonk that anywhere you like in kind of post Third Doctor, I suspect, possibly even season 6B if you wanted to be pedantic. It's an interesting opening, and you wonder if part of it is there just to avoid having to dramatise Dodo's opening scene. That we can just skip that and go Pracy. Anyway, another time there was this girl and nothing was funny going on with her parentage because she had a brother. The end. I'm
going to give you three answers to that question. Number one, the answer is William Hartnell, because that's really the only Doctor that John Lucarotti ends up writing for. That he has very distinct memories of the Garden of Peace and Kamika and the Aztecs. And that is all recalled on page 1 in the mother of run-on sentences. The grandmother, the Catherine de' Medici of run-on sentences, talks about Kamika and the Aztecs. So that's a reason to believe it's the Hartnell Doctor. On Rekar's Doctor Who in the 90s, the theory was that this took place in the garden of the house on Allen Road that Andrew Cartmel and Ben Aronovich used as the Doctor's home base throughout the 1990s New Adventures. Second theory, Stephen Moffat in the novelization of Day of the Doctor, which we are probably never going to cover on this show because I don't plan on covering the new series novelizations unless there's a big clamor from Doctor Who Lit Nation for me to do so. Answers on a postcard. But you go through that entire novelization wondering, wait a minute, just which Doctor is narrating this? And at the very end, you learn that it's Jodie Whittaker. So there is room for Jodie Whittaker to be the narrator of the Massacre. Of course, now, thanks to what Chris Chibnall and Neil Patrick Harris as the Toymaker have done in making a jigsaw of the Doctor's life, we now have this retconned notion of infinite Doctors in infinite combination. It could be the Irish policeman Doctor from Ascension of the Cybermen. It could be the Philip Hinchcliffe Doctor, speaking of friends of the podcast, from Brandon Morbius. I think it's Ncuti Gatwa. Right now, let's say it's the Ncuti Gatwa Doctor. Let's get Ncuti Gatwa to record an audio narration for this novelization because he could probably make those run-on sentences work. And let's say it's Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor sitting there in the Garden of Peace talking to the Time Lords. Oh, wait. The Time Lords no longer exist by the time Ncuti Gatwa comes around, so that's an ontological impossibility. Never mind. I'll go back to my William Hartnell answer.
Okay. So I'm gathering that I'm not going to be quizzed on Nigel Robinson's Doctor Who second quiz book.
I did not bring the second Doctor Who quiz book with me, although the fact machine is here in my hotel room. Smudge is not, Massacre is not. However, if you like, we can play a spontaneous game of 20 questions.
Well, we can give it a go.
All right. Let me load up the randomizer. Those are very good randomizer noises. Almost as good as your Jackie Lane speaking in Mancunian on an nth generation muffled audio soundtrack. All right, I have picked a story at random, and it's random, but it's very thematic for the day that I've had that you don't know about yet. Question number 1. You have 20 yes or no questions to figure out which Doctor Who story I've plucked at random from the randomizer.net, the production of Flight Through Entirety, a show that I have never been on, but which I seem to mention every episode on this podcast. Question number 1, to guess what story it is.
Is it 20th Century Who?
No, it is not 20th Century Who, so you are 0 for 1.
Okay. Is it Stephen Moffat produced Who?
That's an interesting guess because you're going out of order with the showrunners. But yes, the answer is yes, it is Stephen Moffat.
I just thought it was the fattest chunk. So,
that's a very cruel way to refer to Stephen Moffat.
Oh, dear me. Right. So, is it Matt Smith Who?
You're 2 for 3. It is Matt Smith Who, and you have a chance now. If you can guess the Matt Smith story, you could be the all-time winner of 20 questions and get it in 4. But that would be a remarkable needle in a haystack guess. You may wish to narrow it down a little bit further. The choice of filling in the blanks I'd rather leave to you, as somebody once said.
It's like the day you've had today, but I don't know anything about that yet. You've been in London. You've been to the Who shop. You've made purchases. The Beast Below. Is it The Beast Below?
Oh my goodness. I can't think of any direct connection between The Beast Below and the Who shop. Although, since Queen Elizabeth X is in The Beast Below, you might have assumed that I was at Buckingham Palace today, but I was not, although I was there in June my previous trip. It is not The Beast Below. You are not going to be the all-time winner of 20 questions.
Is it a Clara episode?
No, it is not a Clara episode.
So I was in the right ballpark. Okay.
Now you're at question 6. You can still get a very respectable, high-ranking answer if you get it with 6, but you haven't quite narrowed it down fully.
No.
A few other companions to get through.
No. Is it a Stephen Moffat written story?
So question 2 was, is it Stephen Moffat produced? Question 2, is it Moffat written? The answer is no, it is not Moffat written. Question 7. And you've gotten 4 out of the 6 have had no answers, so you are knowing your way to a yes.
So let's have a look. That does limit it a bit.
Now, if you pause the recording, if you go back in time and listen to the cold open where Denise and I are talking about what we did today, you will have the answer. But you don't have that advantage.
Darn it all. Right, I'm just going to have to go. Now, you see, my mind has now gone blank that I cannot remember the names of these episodes. You
give me the Friends titles.
Okay. The one with Vincent. Is it the one with Vincent van Gogh, as they would say on Friends?
So the question, is it Vincent and the Doctor? That is a
good
guess, but that episode does not take place in London, so the answer is no, it isn't. Although a part of it does, I guess, the Bill Nighy part, but no, it is not Vincent and the Doctor.
I just thought you might have gone to a gallery.
I did not meet Bill Nighy today, sorry.
Okay. Oh, well, I suppose I'm just going to have to go. So it feels like we've got a London connection, so we can rule out Amy's Choice because that just happens in the countryside. You've been in a dirty, grim metropolis. We can rule out Vampires of Venice because that is not in London for some reason.
I have never been to Venice.
We can rule out the Chibnall Silurian two-parter because that is very Welsh. So I think we may have to move on to the next season. I think it's very unlikely that you've met dinosaurs on a spaceship or been in the Wild West.
I have been in the Wild West, and I've been to Spain, where a town called Mercy was shot. But no, it is obviously not those stories. But I'm not counting that as a question. I'm counting that as your random musings.
That's a relief. You really shouldn't have answered in that. I'm going to have to find something. My brain is going quite blank on non-Moffat Amy era Doctor Who.
So what you don't know is that there are 3 judges who sit behind me and actually score these episodes. And these are the same 3 judges who go to Mets games and vote on the Nikon camera player of the game after every New York Mets baseball game. Same judges. They are asking me to count that as a question. So the question is it not set in London? Is it a non-London story? And the answer was no, it is not a story set outside of London. So that's a no.
Okay.
Thanks, judges. You may go back to your Mets watching.
Oh, my brain. You see, this is why I'm trying to remember all the new series Who's. Oh, blimey, Charlie, it's all falling apart now.
You think about the seasons that Stephen Moffat produced, and you think about who the companion was. You've already ruled out the, I guess, 2.5 or 3.5 Clara seasons.
Mm-hmm.
That leaves you with the slightly less than half of the Moffat era. And once you figure out who the companion is, you can also narrow down the stories that were not written by Moffat versus stories that are not set outside of where I'm sitting right now.
Hang on.
It's a limited subset.
Yeah, you see, now I want to say, is it closing time?
That is a very good guess, but it is not closing time.
Oh, curse my life. Curse my poor rotten old bones. We must be about 37 questions by now.
We are now at question 10. It would have been 9, but the judges overruled me.
This is such a debacle. What else can I remember now from those episodes?
I suggest you go methodically. Graham Burke would go season by season, playing the game to narrow it down. That might give you a sporting chance.
Oh, I suppose we could very well go for Victory of the Embarrassingly Large Daleks. That's a London story.
So your question is it the one
is it
with the
Victory of the...
And the answer is yes, it is Victory of the Daleks.
Praise the Lord. I'd forgotten everything from that episode apart from Bill Patterson, who, again, is an actor with a lovely voice. Oh, well, I can excuse myself for having forgotten it existed.
As people who have heard the cold open of this show, and you'll be one of them on Sunday, know, Denise and I were at the Churchill War Rooms earlier today. And in the Churchill War Rooms is a display of all the actors who have played Churchill, including Ian McNeice in Doctor Who Victory of the Daleks, immortalized forever in the Churchill Museum. So when
Did you have a cup of tea?
No, but what I have, and I will show you now, and the audience won't be able to see it because the audience is sitting at quite a remove from me. I do have things that I bought for swag at the Churchill War Museum gift shop. So here we have Winston Churchill socks. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. So I now have...
My socks are like that after a while, to be honest.
I will be wearing these to court one day in my future legal career. I also have a Churchill War Rooms t-shirt, London, which has Churchill's distinctive silhouette on it. If you're walking around Brooklyn and see me wearing this t-shirt, you will know it is me because of the t-shirt. And I got from my daughter, who is right now at the Taylor Swift concert, a keychain that says, "The future is female."
I can't believe Winston Churchill ever said that. I think Winston Churchill was very much saying the future is about eradicating people that I don't think are worthy and the Welsh miners. He's been lionised because he had a good war, as they say. But dear Lord, if we're talking about Doctor Who historicals which aren't exactly accurate, the vision of Churchill is quite a troubling one, because the real man was complicated and not as nice as your socks.
And those are very nice socks. Although I would venture to say that 99.8% of Doctor Who literature guests will never see the socks. But fortunately, one of my recurring guests, Callie, lives in my house and will see those socks at some point. So, Ian, you will be back on this show within the next few months covering a book that I have not yet named, but which most of the audience can figure out what it is. I very much look forward to having that conversation with you. I'll be enjoying the rest of my trip through the British Isles. This is sadly my last full day in London, but the Churchill War exhibit, the War Cabinet rooms, are a remarkable museum, and I'd recommend that anybody who has not been there already go. But don't tell them Jason sent you, because they have no idea who I am. Just one more random visitor who bought Churchill socks.
Well, have a great time over here, and try not to talk too much about baseball. You will alarm people.
I actually brought a Mets cap with me because our hotel shower is giving me a very serious case of bad hair days.
Mm-hmm. You can wear your Mets cap with your new red socks and thus confuse everyone greatly. And that's the limit of my American sport knowledge.
What you don't know is that in the summer of 1988, I was on a teen tour of Boston, and it was a chilly day in Salem, and we were going to the Salem Witch Museum, and I was wearing my Mets jacket. And this is about 18 months after the Mets defeated the Red Sox in the 1986 World Series. And this old man, very old man, old enough to probably remember the Red Sox last World Series win in 1918 at that point, was following me around menacingly and confronted me on the steps outside of the Salem Witch Museum and goes, "Nice jacket you got there, Sonny." And then walked away giving me the dirtiest of looks. So I will never again wear Mets cap in Red Sox territory. Especially when wearing red. I think it may have been the worst thing that ever happened in Salem. Exactly, the second worst thing. Some of us still remember Giles Corey, you know. But yes, I will not be wearing the Mets cap with the Red Sox. That is a very good baseball reference. Well, it's better than clearly my Moffat Doctor Who memory. Deary me. All right, Ian, thanks again for joining us. Thank you. After the break, I will have an expert. Hugenot! On the religious experts of the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day after the break, after this word from the Direction Point, Doctor Who Podcast Network. Direction Point. Direction Point.
A Whovian and a Nuvian walk into a TARDIS
and explore every episode of the classic Doctor Who series.
Join me, podcaster John S. Drew,
and me, writer-editor Jim Beard, as we take apart each story starting from the very beginning in 1963.
And join us on our Facebook page and Twitter, where we continue the discussion with you with historical artifacts from British papers of the time. The Doctor's Beard Podcast, released every Saturday around tea time on your favorite podcasting app.
And we'll see you in time and space. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature. Keep turning the pages.
My next guest happens to be an expert on matters pertaining to the religious elements of the massacre. I will confess, growing up Jewish in the United States, I don't have much of a frame of reference for what happened to the Protestants in this story as oppressed victims of the Catholic regime in France in the 16th century. So I have an expert to help walk me through this. And sir, what is your name?
My name is Jerrod Hugenot.
I have to ask, how did you come by that last name?
It was handed down to me. As I look at the family history, as you know, the Anglicization of names, Hugenot or Hugenot, as we see in this story, Huguenot. My family surname is presently Hugenot. So there's a drop of one letter. And then looking at some materials about the earliest people that I'm descended from who moved from France to America in the 1830s, even some of those documents spell it Hugnot, Hugenot, or Hugnot, take your pick.
So it is eminently possible that you had And of course, if you go back 450 years, that's a lot of branches on the family tree. But you almost certainly have a direct ancestor somewhere in there who might have had some exposure to the massacre of 1572.
Yeah, I figure somebody along the line took the name as much out of conviction as anything. So yeah, we don't have records that go back quite that far. The earliest descendant I could do using all of the online material, like, I shouldn't name brands, I guess, on a podcast, but those websites that help you with your ancestry. 1785 is about as far back as we have records. And that person and his wife moved to the United States in 1833.
Which leads to my next question. What do you do for a living?
Well, I'm an American Baptist pastor and been ordained 20 years this year. Work with congregations presently in upstate New York for the American Baptist Churches of New York State, sort of a denominational subunit, if you will, like a region, synod, diocese, conference, etc.
Looking behind you at your very impressive workspace, in addition to religious iconography, I can see a TARDIS. I see 3 different copies of The Massacre, and I see a couple of other nonfiction books that kind of sort of pertain to the massacre. So walk me a little bit through the Doctor Who material over your right shoulder.
Okay, well, the Massacre novelization, of course, came out in the late 80s. So we have the original edition, Target novel, in paperback as well as hardback. I only own the Massacre hardback by the good graces of my spouse. I found one online for less than its usual asking price, and out of her grace, I bought it. And then the second edition, I know some people online call them the Blue Spines, the re-release. And then the Black Archive from Obverse Books. You're more familiar with the author, but this is actually the second of the series. So very early in the Obverse Black Archive series, it was the Massacre volume, and it's quite good. I commend the author for an incredible amount of research.
James Couray-Smith, friend of the show. Yes. He's been on the show before, and I'm trying to get him on again, although our various schedules sadly don't align very well. But he has written several Black Archives. He also has a phenomenal Substack. Well, it's not on Substack anymore, but it's called Psychic Paper. And then lastly, the other book that I was going to talk about is now in your hand. And that is a book I am desperate to get, but haven't actually sent away for yet. And that is, what is that book?
The Doctor Who production diary, the Hartnell years. David Brunt is the one who's done all the research, bringing it together. In physical form, you can see it is a paperweight. This is wonderful. Well, one thing, did you know that there is a Hugenot in the Doctor Who family tree?
I was not aware of that.
Well, years ago, I read an article interview. I want to say it was Starlog, which maybe dates us. But it was a Starlog interview with John Pertwee, who talked about his origins. He is of French Huguenot or Huguenot ancestry.
That does ring him. In fact, if memory serves me right, the family name was spelled French, Perthuis, before it got anglicized.
That's correct. I have it here on my little cheat sheet. You did it from memory. I bow before you.
As you call him, Cousin John.
Yeah.
So The Massacre, the novelization, famously has nothing to do with The Massacre, the TV serial. He did the novelization more than 20 years later, presumably as the story that he originally wanted to tell. So there's a lot more for William Hartnell to do in it, and there's a happier ending. You and I are not going to talk about that so much. I will have my audio essay breaking down the novelization later on, and of course my edit interview is talking about the TV production. What I'd like you to help me out with is the accuracy of either the novelization or the TV serial to what actually happened in the summer of 1572.
And that's a good question. We have historical fiction, that can delight, entertain, inform, but sometimes bend the truth, use a little editorial or historical imagination. I think of Spielberg and Tony Kushner's great Lincoln film. So much of that, was maybe guided by Doris Kearns Goodwin's team of rivals, but at the same time, Kushner didn't feel like he had to keep a complete detailing. This is a piece of imagination, and so great film. I think with this era of Doctor Who doing historicals, because that was part of their educational mandate early on, that it is, in some ways, a very strange episode of history to draw from. Because again, the Huguenots, the massacre that happened in August 1572, has some place in history, but it's maybe not as big of a moment for people who study the Protestant Reformation in popular consciousness. So, for example, that famous image of Martin Luther nailing his 95 theses or objections on the door of the church. The Wittenberg door has much more resonance. When I was in seminary, we had church history in 2 semesters, so they were survey classes. You're skating fast to cover that long of time.
Right.
And so the first semester covered up until the Protestant Reformation, and then it began, the next semester. So people would wander down to the bookstore where I worked during seminary, say, "Oh, we killed a bunch of you in class this morning." We all knew, the professor and I had a little bit of a joke about that. And so, if you're studying the Protestant Reformation, but the Huguenot massacre of August 1572 was a significant moment in that it was part of the wars of religion that were quite violent in French history. Certainly anybody who studies much of French history knows that it's about as violent and turmoil driven as any other time. And we go back to that earlier Hartnell series, The Reign of Terror, which is set in a future time period than this. These are raucous times. And so there's a great deal of violence. And then you add in religion and politics. Oh my. 1572 is kind of the capstone of things building to a boiling point. The Catholic and the Protestant in France looked askance at each other. They had differing views. The king, the court, being Catholic, also had varying levels of either toleration towards these Protestants, heretics, people of suspect identity, and other times outright bloody, violent stuff. And so, there's a lot of trauma in this story. And so by 1572, they decided, the king decided to, and his mother decided, maybe, well, let's try this. So they marry off the king's sister to a prince who is of Huguenot persuasion.
And that's going to be Henry of Navarre, if memory serves me right.
Yeah, Henry of Navarre, who later will become King of France. And so here's a little bit of an irony. You see him here at this pivotal moment, but then you'll see him later when he's actually on the throne, and he's become Catholic in order to become king. And he gives out the Edict of Nantes, which puts the brakes on any further intolerance. So again, as I was trying to map out this history to simplify it, it also is complex. And, they say history repeats or it rhymes. Again, here's the saying: the groom of this wedding will be on the throne years later. But there's a lot of contortions before we get there. And so we come to August of 1572, and it is a chilling time to be in Paris, especially with my name.
My most abiding memory of Martin Luther comes from The Simpsons. It's a Halloween episode where Lisa develops an entire civilization out of the bacteria in her tooth. And one of the bacteria nails the feces to the church door, and Lisa exclaims, "I've created Lutherans!" How far are we removed from the actual 95 Theses in 1572?
Yeah, I remember that episode because my wife and I fell off our couch laughing. The Simpsons being one of the great religious contributions of our time, and maybe the only way Gen X ever learned much about religion. 1517 was the 95 Theses. So you can kind of see that in the course of time with Luther towards the beginning of the 1500s, and now we're almost 3/4 of the way through the 1500s, things have really gathered steam, and society and power have been shaken. One of the things that people point out is by this time in the 1570s, the Huguenots were thought to be about 10% of the populace. And they were tied, in some ways to another reformer named John Calvin, who was French, but was based in Geneva. And so you see the Luther branch taking off, and most people would say, "Oh, Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation." Again, arguable in terms of the exact ways we parse out those things. But when you see these key figures, Calvin is the one whose teachings are influencing these French Protestants to get involved with being a people of the book, being, seeking a church that's very biblical, and if need be, being warriors for those views. This again is where we get complicated. It's not Protestants good, Catholics bad. There's blood on everybody's hands during this time period.
And I have to point out, as a third generation New York City, when the Dutch founded New Amsterdam as a colony in the early 1600s, the original settlers were Walloons, who I believe were a Dutch branch of Calvinism. So Calvinism had an outsized influence in the early religious history of New York City, although, of course, so many religions have come and gone as New York City's dominant religion that we are now a long way from the original Dutch city of New Amsterdam. But I do recognize a little more about Calvinism than I do about Martin Luther.
But the thing about the Dutch is also with the Huguenots, after all of this hit the fan, and that is a theological term, after all of this happened, this disruption, and I'm sure your family history has this too, people scattered, a diaspora. And so I have been to Cork, Ireland. There's a Huguenot quarter. There's groups, Huguenot churches in this country. There's a group that still to this day meets in the basement of Canterbury Cathedral because they've had a long-standing offer to be there. One of my Episcopal clergy friends said, "Oh, really? We must fumigate. We got Huguenots in the basement." Anyway.
I am a member of a diaspora myself, so I do have family dispersed on several different continents at this point. But looking back to 1572, what would the death toll have been by the end of the massacre?
Well, the massacre wasn't over in 1 or 2 days. It went on for months. Many sources point to the fact that there were just scads of people slaughtered over a period of time. I think that the official count of any massacre is going to be always a matter of who wrote history, because I've seen 5,000, I've seen 25,000 as the official death toll just in that immediacy. So, again, it kind of makes me question the doctor's wisdom in staying and deciding to hang out for a few days. It's kind of the wrong time to be in town, Doc.
Is there anything in either the TV or the book that completely diverges from the historical record, or is it the correct people issuing the actual orders, and are we getting a pretty fair summary of what would have gone on if we actually materialized in August 1572?
Well, I know some of this because of reading historical material, some of this because of the Black Archive volume. There are characters that either the Lucarati or Donald Tosh, depends on what your feeling is about the authorship there, that create for the convenience of the plot. For example, the doctor is supposedly the doppelganger of the Bishop of Amboise. and the Bishop of Amboise, there was, that area existed. There were maybe, monks in that area, religious order in that general area. But, that is kind of an invention of either version of the script, TV or novel. The question about complicity, when did somebody give the order? Who gave the order? It does feel like some would say that the king, though he was involved and aware of what was going on, also had great remorse after the fact. And so spent the rest of his reign, I think, kind of haunted by this moment. Catherine, his mother, had a long stretch of time with the levers of power because she was the regent for Charles, and was the one who, kind of, in some ways, in the 1560s, was known to be more tolerant. But by the time we get to this moment of critical mass, may have been very much going along with let's rid ourselves of this menace. Admiral de Coligny, who is the kind of focal point of this either version of the book or the TV series, the victim, the person who's marked for assassination, also occupied a very unique spot. He was thoroughly Huguenot in his leanings, but because of his military status, had a great deal of suasion in the court. And so over the years, there were some court intrigue about, at one point in the 1760s, I believe, did he basically try to whack another person, in the French court? So there again, blood on both sides is the best way to put this. The Coligny is, of course, the lightning rod in the story we're talking about.
I'll ask you, how did the Massacre on television work for you as a piece of drama? And then I'll ask you, how does the novelization work as a way of faithfully recounting the various religious factions that we see in the story?
Well, as a piece of essentially now audio drama, because we just have the off-air recording. I think it's quite interesting. But again, if it weren't for the narration provided by Peter Purvis, I would be kind of lost at points. But I think, well, one thing that was interesting about the sound-only version was before they finally gave away that, who is this person who looks like the doctor? You hear kind of this insistent, tapping of the staff, as one of the lackeys comes in, it's like, okay, this has happened. And the doctor hasn't spoken yet, or the abbot hasn't spoken yet. They're kind of suspending and, kind of making you wonder what's going on here. So in the audio version, the televised version, I can imagine more vividly the reveal that it looks very much like the doctor in a black robe is a lot more astonishing. So I think there was some craft being, added to the story, even in the midst of the chaos of that particular stretch of time in Doctor Who production history. And I think the idea that when the scripts were turned in, the suggested title, The War of God, really, gave us an idea of what the intention was of the original scripts versus what we got on screen. And then the War of God in the later 20 years later novelization was in some ways, the author trying to regain a little bit of what he hoped to bring to the screen. But I will also say, from reading the production diary notes, one thing the production notes had was some misgivings about his grasp of history at the time. So obviously he went back to school when he got the chance to write this and correct some things. Because again, it's a lot of tangled history. I mean, just in the 12 years leading up to 1572, there were several twists and turns between the Protestant and Catholics that take a while to unfurl to our unschooled eyes.
So thank you very much for shedding some light on the massacre for me. So there's many ways to enjoy. Well, I wouldn't say enjoy the massacre, but there's many ways to experience the massacre, and you've done, I think, a great job of helping me understand the religious context a little better. Thank you so much.
Well, and I will be honest, historic texts do vary in terms of how user-friendly they are. Darmond McCullough, an English scholar, did a great book that's for a general audience. You just need a forklift to move the book around the house, called The Reformation. And so I read that one summer as my Herculean effort to read, but it was quite good at showing how sprawling this time period is in European history. And then the other is from Yale University Press, The Huguenots, or Huguenots with that extra U spelling. And it is by Geoffrey Treasure.
And that is also a formidable sized volume, just judging by the width on your shelf.
I also like to annoy my wife by having the spine on the shelf where it says Treasure, the Huguenots.
Well, right now, for fun, I am reading the written transcripts of the Richard Nixon White House recordings. And since we just passed the 50th anniversary of Nixon's resignation, and I've been reading the 1973 volume, but the audio tapes don't give great fidelity, and even in the best published transcripts, there's a lot of unclear words, so it's often not clear who's being discussed or what's being said. So I'm rationing myself to one telephone call per day. Now that's going to take about half a year to get through the 1973 and Richard Nixon's secret audio recordings. I don't know if I have the bandwidth to take on a book that size, but I can promise you it'll go onto my reading list someday.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing as we keep working our way through history. The best thing is to keep wrestling with it. If you want some really rip-roaring stuff, if they've ever done the transcripts of LBJ, he was a Texan.
They have them. I think it was Michael Beschloss who did that. I bought the first volume and it was lost in the great purge of my stuff when I lost all my Doctor Who books. But one day I'll reacquire that.
One day. Yes, one day.
We shall come back. All right, Jerrod, thank you so much. It was great having you on. I'm sure we'll speak again. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Doctor Who, The Massacre, written by John Lucarotti, televised as The Massacre, teleplay by, quite frankly, your guess is as good as mine. Screen credit to, well, we're also not quite sure. Televised in February 1966. Paperback release date November 19th, 1987. Target book number 122. Cover artist Tony Mazzaro. The TARDIS lands in Paris on 19 August 1572. Driven by scientific curiosity, the Doctor leaves Stephen to meet and exchange views with the apothecary, Charles Preslin. Before he disappears, he warns Stephen to stay out of mischief, religion, and politics. But in 16th century Paris, it is impossible to remain a mere observer, and Stephen soon finds himself involved with a group of Huguenots. The Protestant minority of France is being threatened by the Catholic hierarchy, and danger stalks the Paris streets. As Stephen tries to find his way back to the TARDIS, he discovers that one of the main persecutors of the Huguenots appears to be the Doctor. I first visited Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in August 2018. That was my first trip to Paris, to date my last, and I spent much of it reenacting City of Death while loudly humming Dudley Simpson's Running Through Paris score, which is also the opening music of this podcast. What I came to realize during my walk through the cathedral on Sunday evening, with services in progress while I was there, is that most of what I knew about Notre Dame first came from John Lucarotti's novelization of The Massacre. Growing up in a non-Catholic household in the States, I was not a student of medieval French architecture, but Lucarotti has the Doctor calculate exactly when the TARDIS has landed, based upon what Notre Dame looks like, and what bridges cross over the Ile de la Cité. That made a huge impression on me in 1987, that you could navigate the timelines just based on how one cathedral looked at one particular moment in time. With the news of April 14th, 2019, that Notre Dame was on fire, my immediate reaction was to go back on social media and repost my Notre Dame photos and videos from my August 2018 vacation. I think the kids call that being a sympathy vampire. My delayed reaction was to reread the novelization, something I hadn't done in years. The last time I would have read the book before April 2019 was likely in August 2009, based upon ticket stubs from the Long Island Railroad and the Metro-North Railroad, whose tagline is not, "Lots of metros have a north," from that month, which I had placed as a bookmark on page 81, in between chapters 8 and 9. Bear in mind I have no recollection of the August 2009 reread or why I stopped halfway through, but my April 2019 reread, the ratings guide review from which forms the basis for most of this audio essay, gives me a clue why. John Lucarotti's prose in this novelization is much, much worse than I remembered from my initial 1980s impression of the book. Here's the first sentence of the prologue. Quote, "The doctor sat in the garden which always reminded him of the Garden of Peace when Stephen, no, not Stephen, his granddaughter Susan, and that nice young couple, Barbara and Ian, had their adventure with the Aztec Indians eons ago." That was the worst sentence I'd ever read. Well, until I got to the first sentence of chapter 1. Quote, "The TARDIS landed with a jolt, which almost threw the young astronaut Stephen Taylor off balance, but the doctor did not seem to notice as he studied the parameters of the time/place orientation printout on the central control panel of the time machine." Ugh, where do you even begin? How do you map those sentences? How do you read them in one breath? I sure couldn't. How is an audiobook narrator supposed to say all this without giggling in the booth? Moving past the prose, well, let's face it, very few other mid-late 80s Target writers have clean hands. No sentences after those two are nearly as bad, because, well, they certainly couldn't be worse. You've already heard my guests and me discuss how incredible the Massacre was on TV. It is a Doctor Who story that isn't. The Doctor is barely in it, and his dual role is barely that. He only has 3 speaking scenes as the Abbot of Amboise, a tertiary character who serves more plot utility as a corpse than as a functioning person. Stephen is lost in time in the 16th century, well-meaning but inept and ineffectual, not able to save any lives or even keep any friends. The Doctor makes no attempt at all to mitigate the massacre. He merely flees, taking an infuriated Stephen behind and picking up Dodo as a companion entirely by accident. That's the story that was produced for TV, and it's really only the kind of tale you can tell once. Here, probably written out of whole cloth by Donald Tosh, on his way out the door, along with producer John Wiles. They angrily tossed the aftermath of the show to a new production team who never made a story like The Massacre again. As best as the historical record tells us, this is not the story that John Lucarotti thought he was selling. The novelization serves, then, as Lucarotti's chance to tell his theory of what might have happened to the Doctor and Stephen in August 1572. Everything from Part 2 onwards on TV diverged seriously from Lucarotti's vision, so very little of what you saw on TV went into the book. The novelization is a completely different tale with a completely different ending. According to Lucarotti, the TARDIS lands in Paris in late summer 1572. Soon the Doctor joins a plot hatched by Hugenot apothecaries, who exploit his uncanny resemblance to a Catholic priest in order to help destabilize the monarchy's evil schemes. Meanwhile, Stephen, having been warned by the Doctor to stay out of mischief, religion, and politics, a rich line not preserved for the TV broadcast, comes to the aid of a Protestant serving girl and quickly joins in that same Hugenot counterplot. We get a lot of scenes from Stephen Taylor's POV, one of the few novelizations to do this, although I can't recommend enough the mid-1990s missing adventure Empire of Glass, which does the same thing. We learn in The Massacre, for example, that Stephen trod the boards in a production of Hamlet in his youth, and he helps unravel the Catholics' anti-Hugenot conspiracy when he overhears someone talking about shriving time, a term he learned from Shakespeare. We also get an up-close look at the League of Apothecaries and their secret hideout in the extensive catacombs beneath Paris. The Doctor, in a meaty double role, really enjoys the heck out of pretending to be the evil Catholic priest. While the massacre still happens on schedule, the Doctor and Stephen manage to take the edge off the historic disaster. The TARDIS departs calmly, with Stephen and the Doctor in good spirits. In a prologue and epilogue, the Time Lords, featured anachronistically, but many other pre-war games targets published in this era were doing the same thing. The Time Lords gently grilled the Doctor over his interference. Although she doesn't appear in the text, the arrival of new companion Dodo Chaplet is referenced, so you can still fit the book in with established continuity. As you close the book, you maybe even feel a little bit smarter. Only, that's not how it happened on TV back in February 1966, not by a long shot. The major change for the book is that the Doctor and the Abbot are distinctly two separate people. The Doctor works closely with the Huguenots to insert himself into gaps in the Abbot's busy ecclesiastical and political schedule, and to try and blunt the Catholics' scheming. The second major change is a character named Simon Duval, who barely registers on TV as the Abbot's aide. Duval mistakes the Doctor for the Abbot and believes that Stephen is an undercover Catholic spy, a fact which Stephen uses to his advantage. At the climax of the book, the Doctor and the Abbot finally cross paths in the same scene at the same time and in front of Duval. The Doctor out-impersonates the Abbot and persuades Duval to slay the genuine article instead of himself, the imposter. You can see why this did not get preserved for TV. Number 1. The identical scene was already played for comedy in episode 5 of The Chase, which feels like a lifetime ago, but was only broadcast a few months before. And more importantly, John Wiles wanted Hartnell gone from the show, and certainly would not have given him that level of double-duty exposure. On TV, Duval only has one scene with the Abbot, and never interacts directly with Stephen. In the book, Duval is central to the Doctor's victory. On TV, he's a peripheral figure, and if you know who he is, boy, you're some fan. Another major change is Stephen's heroism. Stephen in the book has theatrical training and fight skills. He works well with the two principal Huguenots, Gaston Leurent and Nicolas Muss. I apologize again for my French. Stephen does mistake the Abbot's corpse for the Doctor, as on TV, but is much more central to the plot, and is much better at making friends and making his way around Paris. On TV, Stephen awkwardly refuses a sword fight with Emma Thompson's dad, can't find the same Paris address twice without help, and can't pronounce the word apothecary. Rory Williams blowing up the entire cyber fleet and asking the cyber leader if he wants him to repeat the question. This sure ain't. The book has a pat, tidy ending. The Doctor opts to save the life of Anne and her family by using the Abbot's forged credentials to send them to the one part of France that will be safe from the massacre. He gives an ecumenical speech to King Charles that doesn't avert the massacre, but does blunt its edge, well, at least a wee bit. The Doctor is firm in refusing to let Stephen interfere with the established death of Admiral de Coligny, but he tries to prevent the assassination attempt anyway. Now on TV, the attempt is averted by a gust of wind, not William Hartnell. Clearly Lucarati on the one hand, and Tosh and Wiles on the other hand, have very different ideas about the Doctor's role in the universe. Lucarati sees him as a hero capable of bending the timelines. Tosh and Wiles see him as a cipher, who is incapable of even the heroism inherent in a gust of wind. In the book, the Doctor is rewarded by meeting Anne's distant descendant Dodo, who is described as Anne's quote-unquote spitting image. Now, Anne in the book has auburn curls, a look never sported by Jackie Lane in 1966. On TV, the Doctor sends Anne not to safety, but to a house that was already under Catholic guard moments before the massacre itself began. In the book, the massacre's architects, the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, and her ally, the Marshal de Tavannes, are background characters who are frustrated by the Doctor's Abbot impersonation. On TV, de' Medici and Tavannes are about as terrifying a pair of villains as Doctor Who ever gave us. They end the story utterly triumphant. They trade lofty dialogue about heresy having no innocence, the wolves of Paris, kings, such as the inept Charles, being recognized only by the power they wield, and by God having nothing to do with saving Huguenots. Here's an audio clip from television.
I apologize. I thought that...
Never mind. I have it here, the order signed by the King. Our plans for tomorrow can go ahead.
Thank God.
God had very little to do with it. What is this?
The list, madame. When those Huguenots are killed, we need have no further fear of a Protestant France.
We have no need of lists, Marshal. The good people of Paris know their enemies. They will take care of them.
Good people? Madame, if you rouse the mob, the innocent will perish with the guilty.
Innocent? Heresy can have no innocence. France will breathe a purer air after tomorrow.
And Navarre, madame, your son-in-law? Is he to be slaughtered with the others?
Tomorrow, Henry of Navarre will pay for his pretensions to the crown.
Madame, we must not kill Navarre.
Must not.
Protestant Europe will merely shed a pious tear at the death of a few thousand Huguenots. The death of a prince will launch a holy war.
If one Huguenot life escapes me tomorrow, we may both regret this act of mercy.
Not mercy, madame. Policy.
Very well, Marshal. Then you must get him out of Paris. After tomorrow, even I could not save him.
I will see to it, madame.
And Marshal, close the gates of the city now.
The book features very strong dialogue, which is offset by the truly awful prose. There's a travelogue of Paris, much time spent in the now lamented Notre Dame and in the catacombs, and a bittersweet ending where the Doctor and Stephen get to depart as friends, smiling in the face of adversity, having done at least a few good deeds. The TV show is history as it really is, ferocious, uncompromising, and unquestionably fatal, where a gust of wind can save a life, but the Doctor cannot. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, we stay in the Hartnell era, but a story that is slightly more uplifting than the Massacre. I'll be joined by a first-time guest to discuss Ian Marter's posthumous final novelization, Doctor Who: The Rescue. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. The producers are Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guests, Ian Potter and Jerrod Hugenot. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/DrWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.